Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. Not Horror. If you're ready for a story that'll give you chills, make sure to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Now, get cozy, relax, and let's begin today's spooky tale. The graveyard shift at Walmart wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work. I'd been at it for a few months, working odd hours in the sprawling supercenter. The pay wasn't great, but the promise of solitude appealed to me. Night shifts were quieter, more predictable. At least, that's what I told myself. The store was massive, almost unnervingly so when it wasn't crowded. By day, it was alive with customers, the hum of conversations and the beeping of registers filling the air. But by night, it was a different beat. The aisles seemed longer, the fluorescent lights colder, and the silence, a deep, suffocating stillness, seemed to amplify every creak, every sound. The strangeness began subtly, almost imperceptibly. I was restocking shelves in the snack aisle when I first heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the hum of the refrigeration unit. I paused, glancing over my shoulder, but the aisle was empty. The sound was so soft, so fleeting, that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. Manny? I called out, my voice echoing faintly. Manny was the only other person working the shift that night, a quiet guy who usually stuck to him. There was no reply, just the quiet hum of the store. I shook my head, muttering to myself about overactive imaginations, and returned to stacking bags of chips. But as the night wore on, the whispers returned. They didn't seem to come from a single direction. Instead, they surrounded me, as if the walls themselves were murmuring. My heart began to race, and I felt the hair on my arms stand on end. I tried to focus on my work, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe the sound was coming from the HVAC system, or maybe my ears were just playing tricks on me. Still, unease began to creep in. I hurried to the next aisle, hoping to shake the strange feeling, but the whispers followed. It was like they were just out of reach, a language I couldn't quite understand. I spun around, flashlight in hand, illuminating the rows of neatly stacked products. Nothing moved. The aisle was empty, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I decided to check the security cameras in the back room. The idea of someone sneaking around the store, playing pranks, seemed more plausible than whatever else my imagination was conjuring. In the small, cluttered office, I flicked through the camera feed. Each monitor displayed the same sterile, empty aisles I'd just walked through. As I scanned the footage, something caught my eye. In the reflection of one of the freezer doors, there was a figure, blurry, indistinct, but undeniably there. My breath caught in my throat. I rewound the footage, my pulse pounding in my ears. But the figure was gone. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to reappear, but nothing happened. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a smudge on the glass. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The following nights only deepened my unease. Items began falling from shelves without reason. At first, it was just a box or two, but soon entire rows of products would come crashing down as if pushed by unseen hands. The mannequins in the clothing section became particularly unsettling. I'd catch them out of the corner of my eye, their lifeless plastic faces seeming to shift. Once, I swore I saw one turn its head toward me, but when I blinked, it was perfectly still. One night, as I swept the electronics section, I noticed an old man lingering near the TVs. His clothes were tattered, his hair wild, and his eyes, there was something off about his eyes. They were wide and bloodshot, darting around the room as if searching for something. "Sir, the store's about to close," I said, approaching cautiously. He didn't respond at first, just stood there, staring at the blank screens. Then, suddenly, he turned to me, his movements jerky and unnatural. He grabbed my arm with surprising strength, his grip icy cold. "They're watching," he hissed, his voice low and raspy. "Don't let them see you after closing." I yanked my arm free, stumbling back. "Sir, are you okay? Do you need help?" But he was already walking away, muttering to him. By the time I called Manny to help me escort him out, the man had vanished. His words haunted me. Who were they? What had he meant? I couldn't stop thinking about it, and as the nights passed, the whispers grew louder. The sense of being watched became unbearable. One night after my shift ended, I decided to stay behind. I needed to know what was going on. Armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread, I wandered the store, scanning every aisle. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The store was eerily quiet, almost peaceful. Then, the lights flickered. It started with a faint buzz, the fluorescence dimming before shutting off completely. One by one, the lights died, plunging the store into darkness. My flashlight beam cut through the shadows, but it did little to calm my nerves. "Manny!" I called out, though I knew he'd already gone home. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast emptiness. That's when I heard the whispers again, louder now, almost chanting. They seemed to come from everywhere, growing closer with each passing second. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned a corner and froze. The aisle stretched impossibly far, longer than it should have been. At the end stood a door I'd never seen before, black, featureless, and foreboding. The whispers emanated from behind it, insistent and commanding. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The air grew colder with each step, my breath visible in the dim light. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, but before I could touch it, the whispers stopped. Silence, oppressive, suffocating silence. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw them. Shadowy figures with glowing eyes stood at the far end of the aisle, their forms flickering like static on a television screen. They didn't move, but their presence was overwhelming, a suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. Panic took over. I ran, weaving through the aisles, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. The figures didn't follow, but I could feel them, their gaze burning into my back. I burst through the front doors, gasping for air, and stumbled into the parking lot. The cold night air was a relief, but when I looked back, the store was lit as if nothing had happened. I got into my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped out of the lot, refusing to look back. As I reached the edge of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. My heart stopped. In the back seat, barely visible in the dim light, was one of the shadowy figures, its glowing eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. When I first started working at Walmart, I didn't expect anything extraordinary. It was just a job to pay my bills, working the overnight shift. The pay was decent, the hours were quiet, and the work was straightforward. The store's vast aisles stretched into the dim fluorescence, and during the late hours, the emptiness had a strangely comforting feel, or so I thought. It all started on a Thursday night. The shift had been uneventful, with just a few customers drifting in and out. Around 2 a.m., I was tasked with organizing the back stockroom, a cluttered labyrinth of towering shelves and forgotten merchandise. The air back there always felt a little stale, heavy with dust and the faint smell of cardboard. It was an easy enough task, but the stockroom had a reputation among my coworkers. They all claimed it was haunted. "I'm telling you," Manny had said during a coffee break a few weeks ago, "things move on their own back there. You'll stack a box, turn around, and it'll be gone." I'd laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to boredom and overactive imaginations. But that night, I started to wonder if there was something to his stories. As I organized a shelf of electronics, I noticed a faint breeze. That was odd, considering the stockroom had no windows, and the air conditioning vents weren't located anywhere nearby. I ignored it, focusing on my work. But the breeze returned, cooler this time, like a draft sneaking through a crack in the wall. I moved toward the source, brushing aside a stack of old boxes that hadn't been touched in years. Behind them was something I hadn't noticed before, a door. It was small and unmarked, blending seamlessly into the wall. I frowned, trying to recall if I'd ever seen it before, but nothing came to mind. Curiosity got the better of me. I reached for the handle. It was cold, almost unnaturally so, sending a chill up my arm. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air wafting up from below was damp and musty, carrying a metallic tang that made my stomach turn. I hesitated, debating whether to call someone, but the need to know outweighed my fear. Grabbing my flashlight, I started down the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight. The sound amplified in the silence. The space felt tight, the walls closing in as I descended. At the bottom of the stairs was another door, this one older and wooden, with peeling paint and a rusted handle. My pulse quickened as I turned the knob and pushed it open. The room beyond was unlike anything I'd expected. It was massive, far larger than the stockroom above, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. The room was filled with rows of shelves, but they weren't stocked with merchandise. Instead, they held old, decrepit objects, dusty dolls, cracked mirrors, faded photographs, and rusted tools. Everything looked ancient, as if it had been sitting there for decades. I stepped inside, the floor gritty under my shoes. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I moved closer to one of the shelves, picking up a photograph. It was black and white, showing a family standing in front of what looked like an old farmhouse. The image sent a shiver down my spine. The faces of the family members were scratched out, leaving only the outlines of their heads. A sudden noise made me jump, a faint scuffling sound like footsteps shuffling across the floor. I swung the flashlight around. but the beam revealed nothing but empty space. My breathing quickened as the sound came closer this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I backed toward the stairs, the flashlight shaking in my grip. As I turned, my beam caught something in the corner of the room. It was a figure, a tall, shadowy shape that stood completely still, watching me. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and piercing. I froze, unable to move, as the figure tilted its head slowly, almost curiously. Then, without a sound, it took a step toward me. That was all it took to break my paralysis. I bolted for the stairs, my heart pounding as I scrambled up them two at a time. The air around me felt heavy, as if something was pulling me back. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, deliberate and steady. I burst through the door into the stockroom, slamming it shut behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The stockroom was quiet, the air still. I expected the door to rattle, for something to pound against it, but nothing happened. The silence stretched on, and I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak, every shadow made me jump. When my shift ended, I told myself I wouldn't go near that door again. But the next night, it was gone. The area where the door had been was just a blank wall, as if it had never existed. I even moved the boxes to be sure, but there was nothing there. I told Manny about it, hoping for some explanation, but he just looked at me, his face pale. "You found the hidden room," he said quietly. "Everyone who does ends up seeing them." I didn't ask who them was. I didn't want to know. But from that night on, I could feel it, something lingering in the corners of my vision, just out of sight. I quit the job a week later, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint footsteps and the creak of old wood, as if the door is still there, waiting for me to open it again. It was another uneventful night at Walmart, the kind of shift where the minutes dragged on like hours. I worked the front register, even though we rarely got customers after midnight. The eerie quiet of the store was punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the intercom or the hum of the refrigerators in the distance. Around 1 a.m., a man walked in. He was tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and dark circles under his eyes. His clothes were rumpled, his jacket hanging loosely off his thin frame. Something about him immediately set me on edge, though I couldn't say why. He wasn't doing anything overtly strange, just wandering the aisles like any other late-night shopper. I kept an eye on him from the registers, noting how he moved. He didn't seem to have any particular destination, aimlessly meandering from aisle to aisle. He would pick up an item, examine it for a moment, and then place it back on the shelf. What struck me as odd was how quiet he was. Normally, you'd hear footsteps or the rustle of clothes, but this man moved almost silently, like a shadow. After about 20 minutes, he approached the self-checkout area with a single item, a can of soup. I greeted him with a nod, but he didn't respond. Keeping his gaze fixed on the scanner as he placed the can down, he swiped his card to pay, the transaction going through without issue. "Have a good night," I said, as he picked up his bag. He didn't reply. He just turned and walked toward the exit. That's when things started to get strange. The automatic doors didn't open for him. He stopped in front of them, standing completely still. For a moment, I thought maybe the sensors hadn't picked him up, but then I realized the doors weren't malfunctioning. They worked perfectly when Manny, my coworker, stepped outside for a smoke break just an hour earlier. "Sir, do you need help?" I called out, stepping closer. The man turned to face me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His expression was blank, almost doll-like, but his eyes, they were wrong. They were completely black, like twin voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. I froze, unable to look away. He tilted his head slightly as if studying me, and then he vanished. I blinked, my heart racing. 1 second he was there, and the next, the space where he'd stood was empty. The bag with the soup can lay on the floor where he'd dropped it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what I'd just seen. Did I imagine it? Was I hallucinating? I picked up the bag, half expecting it to disappear in my hands, but it was solid. The soup can inside was real, cold to the touch. I rushed to the security room, hoping the cameras would provide some answers. Manny was already there, scrolling through the feeds. "You okay?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a nervous chuckle. "Something weird just happened," I stammered. "I need to check the footage." We rewound the feed to the moment the man entered the store. At first, everything seemed normal. The cameras caught him walking in, browsing the aisles and checking out at the self-service station. But when he reached the doors, the footage glitched. The screen flickered, and for a few seconds, the man was replaced by static. When the feed returned, he was gone. The bag of soup was still there, lying on the floor. What the hell? Manny muttered, leaning closer to the screen. Did you see that? I asked, my voice trembling. Yeah, he said, swallowing hard. That's not normal. We played the footage over and over, but it was the same every time. The man vanished, as if he'd never been there at all. The rest of the night was tense. Every little noise made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When my shift finally ended, I drove home with the lights on in my car and double-checked all the locks on my doors. The next night, I debated calling in sick, but curiosity got the better of me. I needed answers. I needed to know if he would come back, and he did. At precisely 1:13 a.m., the man returned. He was wearing the same clothes, carrying the same vacant expression. He walked the aisles just as he had the night before, picking up random items and placing them back. This time, I didn't wait for him to come to the register. I approached him directly, trying to ignore the fear twisting in my stomach. "Excuse me, sir," I said. "Do you need help finding something?" He turned to look at me, and those black eyes bored into mine. My throat went dry, and for a moment I couldn't speak. Then, in a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere far away, he said, "They're coming." Before I could respond, he turned and walked toward the doors. Once again, they didn't open, and once again, he vanished. This time, I didn't check the cameras. I didn't need to. I quit the next day. I don't know who or what that man was, but I've heard rumors from other night shift work. They've seen him too, wandering the aisles at odd hours, always with the same blank expression and the black, soulless eyes. And every time, he leaves behind the same warning. They're coming. I haven't been back to Walmart since, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I can't shake the feeling that someone or something is watching me. I've worked at Walmart for years, long enough to think I'd seen it all. Shoplifters trying to sneak out with TVs, customers arguing over discounts, and coworkers sharing spooky tales about the night shift. Most of the time, these stories were just harmless fun to pass the time. But one night I experienced something that still keeps me awake, something I can't explain. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, just after midnight. I was restocking shelves near the back of the store. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an almost unnatural glow over the endless aisles of products. Most of the store was empty, save for a few late-night shoppers and a skeleton crew of employees. I had just finished placing a box of cereal on a shelf when my radio crackled to life. "Hey, can someone check aisle 27? A customer said they saw something weird there," said the voice of my coworker, Lisa. I frowned. "Aisle 27? That didn't sound right." I grabbed the radio and replied, "Lisa, are you sure? We don't have an aisle 27 inches." There was a pause. Then Lisa's voice came back, confused but insistent. "That's what the customer said. Maybe they meant a different aisle? Just check it out, will you?" I sighed, thinking it was probably just a mistake. Still, I decided to humor her. I pushed my cart toward the back of the store, scanning the signs above the aisles. They ended at 26, just like I thought. But as I turned the corner near the hardware section, I stopped in my tracks. There it was, aisle 27. The sign hung above the aisle as plain as day, its bold white numbers illuminated by the same harsh fluorescent lights as the rest of the store. I stared at it, my heart pounding. I'd worked this store for years. I knew every aisle by heart. There had never been an aisle 27. I glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" But the store was eerily quiet. Gathering my courage, I stepped into the aisle. The first thing I noticed was the cold. The temperature dropped sharply as soon as I entered, like stepping into a freezer. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my chest. The shelves were lined with items I didn't recognize. Dusty jars filled with murky liquid, old-fashioned tools that looked more like torture devices than hardware, and strange dolls with hollow eyes and stitched mouths. Everything looked aged, as if it had been sitting there for decades, untouched. I walked further down the aisle, my footsteps echoing unnaturally. There was a strange hum in the air, a low vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I saw him. At the far end of the aisle stood a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in a black suit that looked out of place in the casual setting of a Walmart. His back was to me, and he seemed to be examining something on the shelf. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice trembling. The man didn't move. I took a step closer. "Sir, the store's closing soon. Do you need any help?" Still no response. I moved closer, my stomach twisting with unease. As I got within a few feet of him, he turned suddenly, and I froze. His face was wrong, pale and stretched like wax melting under a flame. His eyes were pitch black, deep voids that seemed to pull at my soul. His mouth curled into a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The man tilted his head, his smile widening, and then he spoke. You shouldn't be here. His voice was low and distorted, like it was coming from an old, broken radio. Before I could react, the lights in the aisle flickered and went out. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking, and when I turned it on, the aisle was empty. The man was gone. The shelves were bare, the strange items vanished. Even the sign for aisle 27 had disappeared. I stumbled back into the main part of the store, gasping for air. The temperature returned to normal, the oppressive heaviness lifting. I grabbed my radio, my voice frantic. Lisa, where are you? I need you to come to the back now. There was no response. I rushed to the front of the store, desperate to find someone, anyone, but it was completely empty. The shoppers, my coworkers, even the manager, all gone. The only sound was the hum of the lights and the faint echo of my own footsteps. I didn't wait to clock out. I grabbed my bag from the break room and ran to my car, not stopping until I was safely locked inside. The next day, I called in sick. When I finally mustered the courage to return to work a few days later, I asked Lisa about the call she'd made that night. What are you talking about? She said, looking genuinely confused. I didn't call you about any aisle 27. I checked the store map again just to be sure. There was no aisle 27. There never had been. But sometimes late at night, I think about that man and his chilling smile. I wonder if the aisle still exists, hidden somewhere in the endless rows of shelves, waiting for someone else to find it. And I wonder if they'll be able to leave. When I first started working at Walmart, I was eager to pick up as many shifts as possible. The overnight shifts, though grueling, were my favorite. The store was quieter, the aisles deserted, and I could work in peace without the chaos of daytime customers. But one particular night made me question my sanity and my safety. It was a slow Tuesday, the kind of shift where the minutes crawled by. Around 2 a.m., I was assigned to organize the clearance section, tucked away near the back corner of the store. The area always felt a bit off to me. The lights seemed dimmer, the air colder, and it was eerily silent, save for the occasional hum of the air conditioner. As I was sorting through a pile of discounted items, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, expecting to see a coworker, but the aisle was empty. Shrugging it off as my imagination, I went back to work. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. I paused, listening intently. The sound was coming from further down the aisle, near the edge where clearance items gave way to the lawn and garden section. It was steady, deliberate, like someone tapping their fingernails against a shelf. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. Gripping my box cutter for reassurance, I walked toward the source of the sound. As I turned the corner, I froze. There was a man standing at the far end of the aisle, his back to me. He was dressed in an old Walmart uniform, the kind the company hadn't used in years. Navy blue with a bold yellow logo on the back. His posture was stiff, his head slightly tilted to one side, as if he were listening for something. Hey, can I help you? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't move. I took a cautious step forward. Sir, the store's closed. You're not supposed to be back here? Still no response. That's when I noticed something strange about him. His uniform was faded and frayed, the fabric torn in places. His shoes were scuffed and coated in a thin layer of dust, like he'd been walking through a desert. I stepped closer, and as I did, the man began to hum. The sound was low and tuneless, sending chills up my spine. I stopped, my heart pounding. Are you okay? I managed to ask. Finally, he moved. Slowly, he turned to face me, and I wished he hadn't. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and glassy. His mouth was twisted into a slight smile that didn't reach his lifeless eyes. His name tag, pinned crookedly to his chest, read, Elliot. Something about him was deeply unsettling, but I couldn't figure out what it was until he spoke. Yeah, you shouldn't be here, he said, his voice a hollow whisper. Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. I stood there for a moment, frozen. Then, snapping out of it, I chased after him. When I turned the corner, he was gone. The aisle was empty. I searched the nearby sections, calling out for him, but there was no sign of the man. Confused and shaken, I returned to the front of the store and told my manager, Carla, what I'd seen. Carla frowned. Elliot, that name sounds familiar, she said, flipping through her phone. After a few minutes of searching, her face turned pale. Elliot was an employee here years ago, she said. He worked the night shift, but he disappeared one night during his shift. They found his car in the parking lot, but no trace of him. People said he just vanished. I stared at her, my stomach twisting in knots. Are you saying I just saw a ghost? Carla shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. I don't know what you saw, but if it was Elliot, you're not the first person to report something strange. A few other night shift workers have mentioned seeing someone who matches his description. I didn't know what to say. I spent the rest of my shift feeling like I was being watched, every creak and shadow setting my nerves on edge. A week later, I was restocking shelves in the same area when I found something that made my blood run cold. Tucked between two boxes of clearance items was an old Walmart vest, identical to the one Elliot had been wearing. It was dusty and faded, the logo barely visible. Pinned to the vest was a name tag, Elliot. I didn't touch it. Instead, I left the aisle and told Carla. When she came to check, the vest was gone. I quit my job a month later. Even now, I sometimes think about that night and the man I saw. Who or what was he? Was he trying to warn me about something, or was he just stuck, replaying his final moments? Whatever the truth is, I don't plan on going back to find out. And if you ever work the night shift at Walmart, be careful in the clearance section. You might just meet Elliot, the employee who never clocked out.